All right, I'm on page 8 of the notes. It's a little hard to break these talks up. They don't all end at the same place, and I'm not going to get all the way through all the notes I gave you today. I'm going to try to stop a bit earlier, a famous statement that never gets fulfilled. But I'm going to try to do that, so I've sent the notes out a bit hitchily-pitchily. I apologize for that. But 32, I'm going to pick up where we left off. We have been looking at Leviticus 25. And if you have your notes with you, on page 1 of the notes, I've got the whole text of Leviticus written out for you. And I've tried to say in Leviticus 25, well, I guess I'll put it here. In Leviticus 25, you have the descent into poverty, and I'm not quite sure how to draw a person descending into poverty, but here's our brother descending into poverty, and there is a series of 4 safety nets. I'm not sure that they are 4 distinct nets or one big net with 4 layers, but anyhow, there's 4 very clearly demarcated steps down in the Hebrew, with the word for poor only being used at these points. So it's very clear that the author of Leviticus is marking out for us how this person descends into poverty. And the opening stage, very quickly, is if a person becomes poor, a brother, and sells some of his land, then the answer in stage 1 is redemption of the land. And ultimately, if all else fails, Jubilee. Then in stage 2, this same brother, who's already sold some of his land to help him get out of poverty, really he leases the land, but the word here is sell. Stage 2 is that the same poor brother is now for some reason unable to support himself. He is, the Hebrew says, shaken. Maybe he's had a flood, a tornado, a drought. Maybe he had amoeba. Who knows? But he's shaken, and he is to be supported by you. He is to come to live with you. And so now he comes, and he's living with you. And while he's living with you, you're to charge him no interest and no profit on supplies, food, that you might feed him. And I said last week, and let me just say it very quickly again, it is incredible when this is read within the context of the story. Everywhere else in the ancient Near East, he would be charged somewhere between 25 to 33% interest. Can I say that again? Somewhere between 25 to 33% interest. And you can see, if you have any imagination at all, that you would never get out of debt. And so people who slipped even slightly over the edge of debt would never be able to crawl back up out of debt, because the slippery slope was 25 to 33% interest. Can you imagine? And it's a scary thing. I had a daughter many years ago whose name I won't mention, but she's number 3. And she was buying something, and she had a credit card, and she was so happy to have the credit card, and she got a little behind on her credit card payments, and they were sticking her for, I forget what it was, but it was some astronomical sum. And she paid it off, and she came in one day with a pair of scissors and her credit card, and she cut it up, and she said, "See, Dad, I'm going to stay out of debt." And I thought, aha, and at 20, 25%, you would want to cut up the credit card, right? And this person who fell into this debt, no interest, no profit on him. Stage 3, he continues to fall. And his fall continues on page 2 of the notes, by the way. Stage 3, he's still becoming poor. This dependent one, who's a brother, is so impoverished at stage 3 that he does what the text says. He sells himself to you. That is, he becomes a slave. And he sells himself to you, which is a terrible thing. The answer here is that you let him work with you. That is, you give him work. The answer to poverty and indebtedness is not charity, but it's work, hard work. And he's allowed to work. You provide work for him, and you do not deal with him ruthlessly. So you're kind to him, but he's moved in with you, he's taken his family, and you provide a house and food and clothes and whatever he needs to support him. And he works for you, and he stays with you, and he works until he's finally released at the Jubilee. And just how far off that is depends on when he started the work. And then the fourth stage, which is just the unthinkable, but it's very clearly marked out, is that in some cases the brother might not find another brother to whom he sells himself, so he has to sell himself to a non-brother, to an alien, to an outsider, to some wealthy alien. And the answer there is, interestingly enough, is that you try to redeem him, which is not mentioned here, or here, it is mentioned here. You try to redeem him, and the law is that he would be released in Jubilee, and the law also says that the outside brothers are to keep track of this brother, and if he's being mistreated, they're to intervene. We're not told the mechanism, we're simply told the principle. But at any rate, we have here then this brother falling into poverty and what's happening to him. Now, in the midst of the fall, right here, you have a parenthesis. Leviticus 25, and if you will, turn with me in your Bibles to this, or you can find it in the notes. I've written it out for you. Leviticus 25. It's always nice to see it in your Bible, not just in my notes, so that you know it really is there. And my notes follow a little different translation here. They're following the NRSV. But in Leviticus 25, you're reading along, and all of a sudden, in this discussion of this third stage, you get what is it can only be described as a parenthesis or a footnote. It's clearly an aside. And you say, what's this doing here? Right? Let's look at it. I'm going to read it from my notes. Verse 44, your male and female slaves, and it uses both the male and the female slave word here, are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves, or more precisely, you may buy male and female slaves. I guess I'm quoting NIV, and this is the more literal NRSV. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can will them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life. But you must not rule over your fellow brother, Israelite, ruthlessly. Now, if there ever was a troubling text, this is a troubling text, isn't it? And I've put off coming to this text for as long as possible, and I've spent an awful lot of time over this text. And if there's a class in heaven called Pentateuch, I'm going to enroll, and my hand will go up first day, and I'm going to say, Moses, I suppose Moses will be teaching the class, Moses, what were you thinking about when you did this? Oh, he'll say. Well, I don't know what he'll say. He'll probably say, Wood, you got it wrong, go to the back of the class and start over again. Here's my observations. As noted above, contextual considerations are always the crucial factor in any interpretive move. Now, I know that this class probably seems incredibly complex at times, and indeed it is. But hermeneutics, or interpretation, which we do in every discipline of life, whether it's music or art or business or history or theology or history, we're always interpreting. Everything's an interpretation, isn't it? There are no brute facts. All facts are interpreted facts. The minute you touch a fact, it's touched, isn't it? And you've touched it, and you've given a particular spin to it. There is no objectivity to facts. That's a modern myth that's held place since the Enlightenment. And the postmoderns are absolutely right. Where you stand is what you see. And I learned that not from French philosophers, but I learned that as a missionary. Because I realized very quickly that people see things very differently than me, and they're not crazy. They're just different, that's all. And so there is no such thing as a brute fact. There are only interpreted facts. And so we always have to ask ourselves, in what context is this being handled? Who's touching it? What are they saying? How are they handling it? So what follows are a few suggestions, and these do not really solve the Hebrew slave question. They don't solve this question and this particular text. So I'm not going to solve it for you. I'm simply going to work on it with you. So I'm going to look at three contexts: the literary context, the social world context, the biblical theology context. The story context is already in place, so I leave that. As already noted in the layout of the whole text, Leviticus 25 through 44 interrupts the author's discussion of the safety nets that are put in place to break the four-stage fall of a brother into poverty. The last two stages involve slavery, and I put that in quotation marks because it's not chattel slavery, but the word for slave is used there. Servantry, hired labor, what do you want to call it. The last two stages involve quotation slavery to a brother, and finally slavery to a non-Israelite, stage 4. Why then has the author interrupted this discussion with a comment about Israelite ownership of non-Israelites as slaves, where they are clearly chattel slaves? That is their property. And we've talked about the fact that the word ebed is a wide word which can be used in many different contexts. It can mean, as it does here, chattel slaves that are property. It can mean hired servants. It can mean servant of Yahweh, servant of the Lord. Moses was the servant of the Lord, ebed. It's the same, so it has a wide range here. We always have to ask, what in its context does it mean? Here, when it talks about slaves, they're property. Hebrew scripture, and Greek too, did not have footnotes or parentheses. Right? In fact, it didn't even have spaces between the words. But verses 44 through 46 certainly appear to be a parenthesis. Now, I'm going to modify this sentence a little bit. I'm still struggling with this, and early this morning I was still sweating on it. I would infer, and you always want to be careful when people infer things, don't you? You would say, how did you skate out on that ice? And every so often when you see someone skating out on the ice, you can hear it cracking, can't you? And you say, uh-oh, someone's going to fall through the ice. And inferentialness, when it comes to scriptures, the older I get, the less inferential I want to be. I like to stand as close as to the text, the shore, as I can, and not skate out on inferentiality, because the ice can get very thin. I would infer from this literary observation, that is, that it's a parenthesis, that the author does not wish directly to address the issue of non-Israelite slavery as such. Now, I think so far we're on safe ground, all right? Now, the next piece of sentence, I'm going to cross out and replace it with something else. So, but rather it is saying, and the more I thought about this, I thought, no, I don't think that's quite the right inference. And I'm going to make this the concluding part of the sentence. But, what this parenthesis says, but only mentions buying them, which one assumes to be the possibility of chattel slavery. So you can buy them, and from that one assumes that you can have chattel slavery, which I think is right. Now, for a direct statement about the treatment of chattel slaves by Israelite owners, we must look elsewhere. So what I'm trying to do is to say that while Leviticus is the inference here is that this simply tells us that you may own slaves. When we come over here to the book of the covenant, and that's where we started, and we will come back to that next week, Lord willing, the Exodus 21 through 23 passage, there are a number of passages in this that deal with chattel slaves. Now, the first one that we've been looking at deals with debt slaves, and these really are not slaves in the sense of chattel slaves, but these really are, and there's a number of fairly clear statements, and also in Deuteronomy, about how one deals with chattel slaves. And I'm going to suggest that while this deals with ownership, you may own them, this deals with treatment. Now, of course, that does not erase the problem, all right? I don't want to throw sand in your face about this. This does not erase the problem that they could own slaves. Are you with me? And you can see where in our own history, people could use this text as a key text to say, we may own slaves, the Bible says so. And I don't see how to get around that. And I think I've read everything that's fairly recent available in English on this text. And I can tell you that most people simply go around it. You know, they don't even tackle this. And I'm a bit disappointed that they don't do that. Some smart young person should write us a doctoral dissertation on this passage. It would be very helpful, and I would buy a copy unless it's $300, which they usually are. Then I'll wait for it to come out in paperback. Now, let me back up a sentence. For a direct statement about treatment of the chattel slaves owned by the Israelites, we must look elsewhere, primarily the Book of the Covenant. While Exodus 2:21, 2 through 11 focuses on Hebrew, that is, ethnic as we have understood it, slaves, and we've talked about that passage earlier and used as a springboard to move off into this. Other passages, and here I list them, spell out just treatment of non-Israelite or chattel slaves. And to these passages should be added the passage on kidnapping and the passage on not returning a runaway slave, which I think I will do next Sunday, although the notes are here today, assuming it refers to a non-Israelite slave, which most people do. So there are a number of texts that speak very directly to how you treat chattel slaves. And those will become very critical for understanding what the Bible does say about slavery and what should have happened. We shall discuss the Book of the Covenant passages when we return to the Book of the Covenant. The others we will take up below. This is a first step in understanding this perplexing text. So that's the literary, I've looked at the literary structure of how this works, all right? Now, the social world, and in a sense I'm rehearsing again, but it doesn't hurt to rehearse this because this is so far away from us. I've spent almost all of my adult life working cross-culturally. And I can tell you up to the minute I got on the plane and they shut the door and I left Africa for good, I was still working on trying to figure out how to be cross-cultural. I've been at it for 40 years, and I want to tell you up front, I'm not very good at it. And if you blink, you're in trouble because something's changed, all right? It's just very hard to always be reading signals from a culture that you don't understand. And the biblical text is an entirely different culture than ours. It's traditional. It reads in Hebrew. It eats things, well, you wouldn't want to eat them, all right? And it has smells. It's too bad that missionary letters never had scratch and smell. I mean, that's where you really get down to the nitty-gritty of it, right? I mean, photos are wonderful, but, Microsoft hasn't developed scratch and smell. And when they get scratch and smell, then you get real missionary letters. Social world. We tend to read back into the chattel slavery of the Bible and the ancient Near East, the American, both North American and Central, and I say by way of footnote, most of the slaves were in Central America. I think perhaps you know that from your high school, college studies. We tend to read our own perspective back into this, and that was an experience of huge numbers of black African slaves who were kidnapped, transported, and sold. Now, obviously, the non-Israelite slaves were not black Africans. Or as my wife said to me, well, not very many of them. There may have been the Nubian slave now and then, and we now know that the Nubians, the black people, were pharaohs in Egypt, which is not slavery, for about a century and a half. And Moses married a black woman. But you wouldn't find very many black slaves. So slavery is not it's not a color issue. It's not race as we call it. It would be more likely to be an ethnic issue, if anything. So obviously the non-Israelite slaves were not black. The Africans, at least not very often. These were chattel slaves. These chattel slaves of the ancient Near East and Israel were most often those who had been captured in war. That would surely be the great source of supply for them. They came from war. In modern times, they would have been called prisoners of war. Kidnapping, which is where black African slavery came from, kidnapping was not allowed in the biblical law nor in the Code of Hammurabi. So kidnapping's out for the Middle East. So just to think about the American experience and the ancient Near Eastern experience, the American slaves were all people who had been kidnapped. Huh? They'd all been kidnapped, stolen. That just didn't happen in the ancient Near East. So it's an entirely different sort of ethos. All right? We just need to keep that in mind. In the southern states of America and elsewhere, large numbers of chattel slaves were used to do low-level manual work. You know, they went out and picked cotton. But this is not the case in the ancient Near East. Only later in the Greco-Roman society, that is 1,500 years later, 1,000 years later, do we have slavery in the sense of the emergence of a slave state. And when we get to that, we'll talk about the Greco-Roman slave states where slaves were used in huge numbers in mines, where basically they went and worked for a few years and died, and in huge plantations. And of course, that would be much closer to the American experience. But that's not ancient Near East. It's not the biblical experience of the settlement period. We have no real data on how many Israelite chattel slaves were owned by Israelites. Large work gangs to construct cities, temples, military fortresses come much, much later in the story, in the time of Solomon. That's at least 400 years later, I would think. We will have to assess just who made up the members of those gangs, the forced labor people of the time of Solomon when we get there. It is hard to imagine small farmers during the early settlement, this would be Joshua, Judges, and early Samuel, being able to buy slaves. It is true that the Gibeonites, instead of being killed, which is what should have happened to them, they fooled Joshua, as was commanded that they be killed in Deuteronomy 7, and we'll get to that text eventually, were allowed to become slaves to Israel. And so Joshua 9:21 says, if I can remember my King Jimmy, they were hewers of wood and drawers of water, something like that. You know, they were the bottom ranks. They were slaves in that sense. Other Canaanites who should have been killed were allowed to live and apparently became slaves. You read Judges chapter 1, you get a little window into the social environment of that day. As is so often the case in the ancient Near East, and especially in the biblical world, painting a portrait of the social world is difficult because there's very little paint. There's very little data. When you go to dip your paintbrush into the box of data, there's not very much there to work with, both in terms of written material and archaeological material, other sorts of material. All this to say that we must not imagine early settlement Israel, the time of Joshua to David, to be anything like the Greco-Roman slave situation, and certainly not like the American experience of plantation slavery. I'm not going to say that again, but that's worth the price of the lecture, isn't it? And of course, we know what you paid for this lecture, so we won't go into that in too much detail. Furthermore, we need to pause and remind ourselves that within Israel, all Israelites were landowners, even if they had been forced by poverty to lease their land until it's returned in the Jubilee. There may have been a small minority of Israelite debt slaves who in effect were hired hands, but at least among Israelites there was no permanent slave class, and possibly the number of non-Israelite chattel slaves was very limited. We simply don't know. We simply don't know. Israel was essentially a one-class society made up of small farmers who owned and worked their own land. But in the ancient Near East, there were, and this is a well-established thing, and I quote Baker here, there were three classes. Let me just pause for a second and read the footnote to you. David L. Baker, who was a colleague of mine with the Overseas Missionary Fellowship, he worked in Indonesia and I worked in the Philippines, collaborated with us in the very early days on a theology of poverty course for our first-year PhD students. And about 2 years ago, he finally got his notes together and published this wonderful book called Tight Fists or Open Hands, Wealth and Poverty in the Old Testament. It's a marvelous book, and I highly recommend it to you. And much of what I'm saying here I've stolen from David and tried to put a footnote in so I'm not plagiarizing. And I simply reproduce what is a standard chart here. Baker says that for the Mesopotamian world, you had three levels. And very quickly, they were the elite citizens or the freemen. And here you have the word that would have been found in the Code of Hammurabi, including priests, nobility, officials, and merchants. These were all landowners. These were all landowners. The second set would have been subordinate citizens or serfs, and they have a distinctive name in the Code of Hammurabi, including craftsmen, shepherds, laborers, tenant farmers, who worked for the state or for private owners, but had no land of their own. And then the third would be chattel slaves, considered to be property of their owners, including foreign slaves, and so on and so forth. So you had a three-tier society. In Israel, by way of contrast, in Israel you have a one-tier society. Everybody is a landowner. Now, some of them may have had to lease their land, and they've slipped down, and someone may have leased the land from someone, and they're slightly above them. But in the rest of the world, in Mesopotamia and clearly in Egypt, only the upper-class elite had land. Everybody else had non-land. Now, I can tell by looking at your fingers that you're not farmers. Right? You can always tell a man's occupation by looking at his fingers, can't you? And you can tell by looking at my fingers that I don't do any serious work. I mean, there's a little bit of a callus. There used to be a callus here when I used to read books in paper. The callus has moved. It's a click, isn't it, as I move slowly down Google Books. But there's no calluses on my hand. I don't farm anything, and neither do you. Right? So none of us are farmers. But everybody in Israel was a landowner and was a farmer, and they own all that. But these people here, they own the land, but everybody else did the work on the land. And so you got two very, very different kinds of society. You have essentially a non-stratified society, and then you have what is really a very highly stratified society. Now, I don't have the time, and I certainly don't have the expertise to walk you through socioeconomically that sort of thing, although there are books on that, in fact, huge books on that, which are quite fascinating and interesting. But it's pretty patent that Israel had a very different social shape than the rest of the world. And I will try to fill in some of that a little later on, but not today. Biblical theology context. Finally, we should ask about a formulation of the biblical theology of justice with specific reference to justice and the possibility of chattel slavery within Israel. It seems to me to be a problem if you have a just God that he lets you own slaves. And I said to someone before the class, I mean, one of the things in this class I'm trying not to do is to avoid problems. One of the things in this class I'm trying not to do is to avoid problems. And if you think you get over this one, then we'll have the killing of the Canaanites, right? And it just doesn't stop. But they're all justice issues. Is it just to kill the Canaanites? And so we'll have to take it on. And so we're going to have to take on, as best we can, we may not answer them, but at least we'll take them on, these difficult questions. And so the biblical theology question then is, can we construct a system here? It is at this stage that the issue really becomes complex and debatable. We should note the following facets of the conversation. So in biblical theology, we're trying to take the various pieces of this story, the canonical story, we're trying to take the various pieces of them and to put them together and to see if they can be formed into a whole. So I'm going to make 3 or 4 statements here, 5. Slavery of Leviticus 25:44 must be understood in light of other chattel slave text in the Book of the Covenant. So whatever we think about this place where it says I may own slaves, I can't just pick that up out of context and make it a pretext for doing something in the South in America. And that's precisely what did happen. I must take that text and read it in light of other texts that speak to chattel slavery and say, and how do I treat those chattel slaves? Right? That's a big if. Second statement. Slavery in the law and the creation perspective of all humans created in the image of God. Now, see if you can follow me on this. The actors in the story, this would be Moses, but maybe before Moses, the actors in the story may not yet have Genesis in their hands, and they may not have a complete understanding of the creation story. I think the truth is we don't know. We don't know quite what they had and what they knew. But the first readers, and we don't quite know who the first readers were, huh? And we too, much, much later, obviously had the whole Pentateuch in hand to read. So what I'm saying is, when the people were reading Leviticus for the first time, they had already in hand Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, didn't they? So they knew the creation story. So their context for reading Leviticus is the creation story. Are you with me on this? Right? So I'm working within the story now. So these actors and the first readers obviously had the whole Pentateuch in hand to read. How does one reconcile the creation perspective that humans are in the image of God and therefore, and I'm not quite sure I've got this right, have value, and maybe that's not the way to say it, with the idea that other humans are less valuable, they're subhuman, and are even considered to be chattel, movable property. So I think there's a tension between this statement and the earlier statements about the image of God. Do you feel that tension? I mean, if everybody's in the image of God, then how can one person enslave another person? Genesis 9 will say very clearly, since everybody's in the image of God, you must not kill somebody else. Huh? So, I mean, how can that be? And I'm not quite sure how you work that out. Thirdly, the slavery law and God's desire to bless all the families of the earth through Abraham and Sarah and their descendants. As you move through the story, you not only have the creation perspective of the image of God, but you have the more dominant perspective, or what becomes the more dominant perspective, of Genesis 12, which says, I will make you a great nation, and through you all the families of the earth will be blessed. Well, enslaving them is not blessing them. Enslaving them is not blessing them. Furthermore, how do we reconcile the covenantal perspective of Israel being a blessing to all the families of the earth with the possibility of their owning chattel slaves? When Abraham was in Egypt, Pharaoh gave him manservants and maidservants to Abraham on account of Sarah. You remember that story. And then it's repeated with Abimelech, gave Abraham male and female slaves on account of Sarah. Yeah, and you remember that story in both cases, Abraham's lying to save his neck. So Abraham had slaves given to him by outsiders. He may not have bought them, but he accepted them. And then we have this interesting phrase, and it comes up in the case where Lot gets captured and Abraham goes off to rescue him. Abraham had 318 trained men born in his household. And later we read that those born in your household or bought with money. That's pretty clear, isn't it? And probably born in the household means that Abraham was breeding slaves. It hurts to even say it, doesn't it? But I think that's probably what the text actually is telling us, that Abraham was a slave breeder. And he also had some that he bought with money. Now, he does circumcise them, because God says to him, circumcise everybody in your household. Genesis 17. If they were bought with money, they were chattel slaves. And you might want to ask, well, if he circumcises them, what does that do for them? Well, we don't know. We just don't know. And even my wife, who has the electric Kindle Bible, and you click on it, it opens up, and there are all the answers and pictures. Even Kindle doesn't know. Right? It's very disappointing. Now, you would like to think, and I would like to think, and I do think, that Abraham treated them very nicely. And that's certainly the hypothesis that I work on. But if you crowd me and press me for data to support my hypothesis, I don't know. Now, shifting gears a little bit, I'm on note 4 now. Is there a path along which a non-Israelite, that is an alien, a slave, could move from being an alien to being a member of the community of Israel? That is, can you get an upgrade? I mean, some of us who've flown all our lives, I've flown, I don't know how many miles I've flown, several million miles. I've never been upgraded. Other people get upgraded on their first flight. I don't get this. But can you get an upgrade from slave class to, member class? Can you be upgraded from alien to Israelite? You with me? Does circumcision get you in? We'll come to that when we deal with the question of the Constitution of Israel. One of the constitutional questions that every constitution has to deal with, just ask any current Israelite about this, Jewish person, what constitutes a Jew? Right? And of course the Constitution of Israel, present Israel, addresses that question. And I'm going to try to squeeze out of Deuteronomy next time around how we talk about citizenship within Israel. And so we'll come back and try to flesh this out a little bit. But is there a path to citizenship that would get you out of slavery status, alien status, and oftentimes those two would overlap? Fifth point. Is there a sense of movement, development, and I left out 2 words here, from what, sorry about that, is there a sense of movement or development from what we would consider a lower standard to a higher one within the story of justice as portrayed in Scriptures? Do you sort of start out with a low-level standard and then God says, now, we're going to raise the bar a little bit, and we're going to raise it a little bit more, and we're going to raise it a little bit more? Huh? Does God deal with Israel as I deal with the people that I trained to play squash in Africa? My key contribution to Africa was to teach Africans how to play squash. And I trained 10 or 12 Africans how to play squash. And when I started out, I hit the ball very softly to them. And once in a while, I'd let them win. And, I'd play them, I'd show them some tricks. When I left Africa, I used to plead to let me have a game once in a while, They were beating the daylights out of me. Of course, they were 30 years younger than me. But does God sort of raise the standard and increase the game? You with me? As we go along? A lot of people believe that. A lot of people believe Old Testament, New Testament means like this. Not under law, under grace. And when they hear Jesus say, you have heard it said, they think Jesus... You with me? It's a major question. And for me, it's a major problem. Because if God doesn't change, and if He's always just, how does this work? You shouldn't kill, except on Saturdays. It's all right on Saturdays. And then you move on and you say, now, all week long you can't kill. I've got problems with this, what strikes me as sort of an evolutionary idea of morality. Did God get better ideas? But that's a stock and trade understanding among the liberals and among the evangelicals. We're on the same page with them in many cases with that. And, I will try to ask that question as we go along. Let me just read my paragraph very carefully. I'm not sure I've got it crafted right. This has become a very hot topic because some have tried to argue that what we need to do is to follow the movement, trajectory of the Bible as it moves from allowing chattel slaves to a more of a moderation of this by Paul, and then beyond the Bible to where slavery in Christianity is abolished. And there are a number of books that use slavery as the upfront model, and then they apply this, and let me read my next sentence and you'll see why the topic gets hot. The movement approach, as you're moving up in your ethics, the movement approach to ethics is then applied to women. And it is argued that although the Bible, both the Old and New Testament, does not make women fully equal to men. This is their argument. Beyond the Bible, within Christianity, women do become fully equal, and they can be senior pastors and do not need to submit to men or husbands, or at least practice mutual submission where it really is mutual. And that's a very standard argument, and I've footnoted it so you can go and see this, and you can see how this argument it works. And there are very, very intelligent, gifted evangelicals working this argument. And at some stage, we'll have to stop and step outside the story and assess how that argument works or doesn't work. Top of page 11, note 6. It will be helpful to sort out a complex of Hebrew terms in their varying English translations about aliens, foreigners, sojourners, slaves, to draw a social map and put all the terms with their various translations on that map and ask who they are and how they relate to each other. And we'll do that at some point. Now, some. Other facets of constructing a biblical theology of slavery with reference to law and asking about justice of it could be added, but this is enough to indicate the complexity of it. It is beyond the scope of our study to deal with all the issues involved in the matter of slavery in the law of Moses and how all the facets fit together. I do work as a scholar, and so let me have a scholarly footnote. The last full-length book written on slavery in the Old Testament is approaching 100 years old. Man, there's a chance for some bright young evangelical who's willing to learn Akkadian and whatever else you have to do, to go and to write a full-length book on slavery in the Old Testament, which of course means slavery in ancient Israel. I mean, it's a 6 or 7 year PhD dissertation, but it probably will be a blockbuster, and no one's tackled it. I think I'm right up to date on the slavery, and I will send you around a bibliography in due course, and I can tell you that nobody has really written at length on this topic. Maybe it's because people think it's a dead topic, but I don't really think it is. It's being used very lively in hermeneutical circles to issue various points. So, there's more to come. Now, I think I'm deliberately going to stop here, although I have my board all set up for what I want to do next. And that is, well, maybe not quite so set up, but what I want to do, it's always a little bit confusing when you look at this board. What I want, let me just tell you, brief me my answer, and next week I will give you the argument, all right? We'll turn the thing upside down. Very bad pedagogy. I want to suggest that the problem here is, how in the world do you put together Leviticus 25 with Deuteronomy and Exodus 21 and Deuteronomy 15? These talk about 6 years and then you're freed. This talks about up to 49 years and then you're freed. How in the world do you put these two passages together? You with me? Now, I'm going to go through the 6 or 7 comparative differences with the passages with you next week. But I just want to suggest for your thinking, and I'll come back and argue it. I think that the difference is that Leviticus, and here's where paying attention to the literary structure really pays off, the 4-stage descent into very, very deep poverty. You can't get any poorer than this person is. They sold everything, including themselves and their family. They're at the very, very bottom, and it's going to take them a long time of hard work to get out of this. Maybe as much as 49 years. Now, of course, it depends when you get onto the train, doesn't it? But for most people, even the average would be 25 years, wouldn't it? Whereas this fellow gets out in 6 years. And I just say it simply, I think the difference is he's not sunk so deep into poverty. And so the way out is not so difficult. And so the way to understand these two texts is not to try to synthesize them into one system. I think you've got 2 different systems addressing 2 different kinds of situation. For people who are just sort of in debt, 6 years, the answer is cut up your credit card, stop buying candy, and you'll get out of debt pretty quick, huh? For the guy who's lost his house, his home, his car, his job, his health, and he's at the very bottom, it's going to take a long time to come out. So there are really 2 different paths out of 2 different situations. At least that's the way I would handle it. So I will start there next week, And also in your notes, you also have the incredible text about what do you do with the runaway slaves. And boy, are we in for a surprise when we get to that.